I'm Aria Kessler, 25 years old, and I carved my own path into the Air Force straight out of college. No shortcuts, no favors, just work. For years, I carried the weight of my father's legacy alone, doing everything I could to honor the man who raised me and the uniform he left behind. But the day a four-star general walked onto my base wearing the ring my father was buried with, everything I thought I knew snapped. I drew a line that changed the course of my entire career. If you've ever been dismissed, overlooked, or blindsided by someone you trusted with everything, tell me your story in the comments. You're not the only one. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after someone crossed the line, hit like and subscribe for more real stories about boundaries, truth, and taking your power back. What happened next I never saw coming. I was 9 years old the first time I understood what it meant to wait. My father had been deployed for 6 months, and I sat on the front steps of base housing every afternoon at 1500 hours, watching the street for his truck. My mother had died 2 years earlier, complications from pneumonia that turned septic before anyone realized how serious it was. After that, it was just him and me, and a rotation of concerned neighbors who brought casseroles and asked too many questions. When he finally came home, he didn't pick me up and spin me around like the other fathers did. He set his duffel bag down, looked at me for a long moment, and said, "You kept the grass cut." I had. Every Saturday, pushing our ancient mower in straight lines the way he'd taught me before he left. He nodded once, and I knew I'd done well. That was our language, small gestures that carried the weight of everything we couldn't say. Growing up as the daughter of an Air Force colonel meant learning to translate silences. It meant understanding that "I'm proud of you" often sounded like "your grades are acceptable," and that love was demonstrated through consistency rather than sentiment. He taught me to iron my school uniforms with hospital corners, to show up 15 minutes early to everything, and to never make excuses when I could make solutions instead. Our house ran on structure, way up at 0600, inspection of my room before school, homework completed before dinner, lights out at 2100. It sounds rigid now, but at the time it felt safe. Predictable. Like as long as I followed the rules, nothing else could fall apart. I became his logistics officer without realizing it. When he got orders to a new base, I researched the schools and found us an apartment. When he deployed, I managed the bills, called the landlord about repairs, and figured out which frozen meals would last the longest. I volunteered at squadron events, smiled at change of command ceremonies, and learned to make small talk with officers' wives who were kind but clearly didn't know what to do with a teenager who had no mother to stand beside. I told myself I was helping, that I was being mature. It took me years to understand I was just trying to be indispensable, trying to make sure he'd never have a reason to leave me behind the way my mother had. He never remarried. Never even dated, as far as I could tell. His life was the mission, and I was part of that mission. He attended every parent-teacher conference, every school awards ceremony, every JROTC event I participated in. He was there, always there, but in the way a commanding officer is there. Watchful. Evaluating. I don't think he knew how to be anything else. The ring was the only personal item he owned that wasn't strictly functional. Black onyx set in white gold, with our family crest engraved across the face, a shield and crossed swords that apparently dated back to some distant European ancestor I'd never heard him mention. He wore it every day, on his right hand, and I only saw him take it off once, the night before a deployment to Afghanistan, when he sat me down at the kitchen table and told me what to do if he didn't come back. I was 16. He slid the ring across the table and said, "This stays with our family. Don't lose it." Then he put it back on and never mentioned it again. 5 years ago, he had a heart attack in his office at Randolph Air Force Base. Massive anterior infarction, the doctors said. He was dead before the medics arrived. He was 52 years old, in perfect health according to his last physical, with no family history of cardiac disease. It didn't matter. He was gone, and I was 22 years old with no living relatives and a funeral to plan. They buried him with full military honors at the base cemetery. 3-volley salute, flag folding, the whole ceremony. I stood there in my civilian clothes I hadn't commissioned yet and watched them lower the casket. The ring was on his finger. I'd made sure of it. It seemed wrong to keep it, like I'd be carrying around a piece of him that was supposed to rest. So I let it go into the ground and told myself that was closure. I finished my degree 3 months later. I'd been in ROTC since freshman year, partly because of the scholarship and partly because I didn't know what else to do. The Air Force was the only life I understood. I commissioned as a second lieutenant, went through training, and received my first assignment to Edwards Air Force Base in California. I told people I joined to honor my father's legacy. Really, I just didn't know how to be a person outside the structure he'd built for me. By the time I made first lieutenant, I'd convinced myself I was doing fine. I had my own career, my own reputation to build. I worked in mission support, coordinating logistics for test wing operations, unglamorous work that kept the base running. I was competent, reliable, and completely unremarkable. Exactly what I'd aimed for. I didn't want to be the colonel's daughter anymore. I wanted to be Lieutenant Kessler, a name that meant nothing to anyone, attached to no legacy and no expectations. But the thing about military bases is that everyone knows everyone, and history has a way of surfacing. Within 6 months, someone in my unit had looked up my father's service record. Suddenly, I was getting comments about big shoes to fill and questions about whether I planned to follow his career track. My squadron commander, a lieutenant colonel named Howard Pierce, made a point of mentioning my father during my first performance review, saying he hoped I'd inherited the colonel's strategic mind. It was meant as a compliment, but it landed like a weight. I smiled and said, "Yes, sir," because that's what you do. But I started keeping my head down even more, avoiding anything that might draw comparisons. I didn't volunteer for high-visibility projects. I didn't speak up in meetings unless directly asked. I made myself small, hoping that if I was quiet enough, people would forget whose daughter I was and just let me be ordinary. It worked mostly. I faded into the background of base operations, one more junior officer in a sea of uniforms, doing my job and going home to an empty dorm room where I microwaved dinners and watched old movies until I was tired enough to sleep. I had one friend, Captain Lynn Ortiz, who worked in personnel and occasionally dragged me to the base gym or out for drinks at the local bar. She knew about my father but never brought it up unless I did first, which I almost never did. We talked about normal things, terrible dates, worse commanders, the eternal question of whether to stay in for 20 years or get out and find something else. I didn't think about the ring. I didn't think about my father, except in the abstract way you think about people who are gone, present in memory, but not in reality. I thought I'd moved on. I thought I'd built something separate. I was wrong. The inspection notice came down on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks before the scheduled date. A 4-star general, General Marcus Redden, Air Combat Command, would be conducting a comprehensive operational readiness evaluation of our wing. The email went out at 0800, and by 0900 the entire base had shifted into pre-inspection panic mode. I'd been through inspections before. They were part of the rhythm of military life, scheduled stress tests where higher-ups evaluated whether your unit could actually do its job under pressure. But this one felt different from the start. The timeline was aggressive, the scope was unusually broad, and the name attached to it carried weight. General Redden wasn't just any 4-star. He had a reputation for being meticulous, unforgiving, and politically connected at levels that made even senior officers nervous. Our wing commander called an all-hands meeting that afternoon. He stood at the front of the auditorium and told us this inspection would set the tone for the next budget cycle, that our performance would directly impact future mission assignments, and that he expected nothing less than excellence from every single person in the room. Then he dismissed us and the real work began. Lieutenant Colonel Pierce gathered our squadron and laid out expectations with the kind of intensity usually reserved for actual combat operations. Duty schedules were revised. Leave was canceled. Every regulation, every checklist, every procedure was pulled out and reviewed. Buildings that hadn't been deep-cleaned in months suddenly got scrubbed until the floors gleamed. Equipment that had been deadlined for repairs was mysteriously fixed overnight. Everyone worked late, came in early, and moved through the days with the kind of exhausted focus that comes from knowing you're being watched. I got assigned to the admin team handling logistics for the visit, coordinating conference rooms, arranging transportation, making sure the general's schedule ran on time. It was grunt work, but it was important grunt work, and I took it seriously. I built spreadsheets, confirmed catering orders, and sent reminder emails to people who outranked me by several pay grades. No one thanked me, but no one yelled at me either, which I counted as success. 3 days before the inspection, I was in the squadron building finishing up paperwork when I overheard a conversation in the hallway. 2 senior officers, a major I didn't recognize and a lieutenant colonel from another unit, were talking in low voices just outside the open door. "Redden's got history with this base," the major said. "He was stationed here back in the 90s. Apparently there's some bad blood." "With who?" the lieutenant colonel asked. "Not sure. Someone in leadership back then. Command's being real careful about who gets face time with him." "Think it'll affect the inspection?" "Everything affects the inspection." They moved on, and I sat there staring at my computer screen, trying to figure out why that conversation made my stomach tighten. Bad blood. History. It probably had nothing to do with me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next morning, Lieutenant Colonel Pierce pulled me aside after a briefing. "Kessler, you're on the general's escort team." I blinked. "Sir?" "You'll shadow the general during facility walkthroughs. Take notes, answer questions if he has any, make sure he gets where he needs to go. You've been doing good work on the prep," leadership noticed. It should have felt like recognition. Instead, it felt like exposure. But I nodded and said, "Yes, sir. I won't let you down." He studied me for a moment, then said, "Your father was a good officer. Let's make sure that name keeps its shine." I forced a smile and walked away before he could see my hands shake. The general arrived at 0700 on a cold Monday morning in March. I stood with the rest of the escort team on the flight line as his C-37 touched down, taxied to a stop, and powered down. The door opened, stairs descended, and General Marcus Redden stepped out into the California sunlight. He was tall, probably 6'2", with gray hair cut military short and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. 4 stars gleamed on his shoulders. Ribbons covered his chest, a career's worth of deployments, commendations, and command time. He moved with the kind of easy authority that comes from decades of people doing exactly what you tell them to do. Our wing commander greeted him first, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries I couldn't hear from where I stood. Then the general moved down the line, acknowledging each member of the greeting party with a nod or a brief word. When he reached me, he paused. "Lieutenant Kessler," the wing commander said, "she'll be part of your escort team." The general extended his hand. "Lieutenant." "Sir." I shook his hand, firm grip, brief, professional. His eyes were pale blue, sharp, assessing. "Let's get to work," he said, and we moved toward the waiting vehicles. The first 2 days of the inspection passed in a blur of conference rooms, facility tours, and briefings. I stayed 3 steps behind the general, took notes on everything, and made sure his schedule stayed on track. He asked questions, pointed, specific questions that made senior officers sweat, and listened to the answers with an expression that gave nothing away. I watched him dismantle weak justifications with a single raised eyebrow and acknowledge good work with a slight nod. He was exactly what you'd expect from a 4-star, brilliant, intimidating, and completely in control. On the 3rd day, we were scheduled to tour the maintenance facilities. It was a routine walkthrough, nothing unusual, but the maintenance officers were on edge. Their shops had to be perfect, tools accounted for, safety protocols visible, every workspace meeting regulation standards. We moved through the first building without incident. The general inspected workstations, asked about turnaround times, and reviewed safety logs. Then we entered a briefing room where the maintenance squadron commander was presenting operational metrics. The room was small, windowless, with a conference table and a projector screen. I stood near the back, taking notes, while the general sat at the head of the table. The briefing droned on readiness rates, parts availability, manning levels. Standard stuff. Then the general reached up and pulled off his gloves. He set them on the table beside his notebook, and that's when I saw it. The ring. Black onyx. White gold. Family crest engraved across the face, shield, and crossed swords. The same ring. The exact same ring my father had been buried with 5 years ago. My pen stopped moving. The briefing continued, but I couldn't hear it anymore. All I could see was that ring, sitting on the general's right hand, catching the fluorescent light the same way my father's had when he'd sat across from me at 1,000 different tables. It wasn't similar. It wasn't a coincidence. It was identical, down to the small scratch on the left edge that had been there for as long as I could remember. I must have made a sound, a sharp breath, something, because Captain Ortiz, who was standing next to me, glanced over with concern. I shook my head slightly, but I couldn't look away from the ring. The briefing ended. The maintenance commander asked if there were any questions. The general said no, thanked him, and stood. He reached for his gloves. I moved before I could think about it. "Sir." My voice came out steady, which surprised me. The general paused, gloves in hand, and turned to look at me. "Yes, Lieutenant." Everyone in the room was staring now. I could feel their eyes, the weight of protocol I was about to shatter, but I couldn't stop. "Your ring, sir." I kept my tone respectful, professional. "Where did you get it?" The room went silent. Utterly, completely silent. The general's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. He looked down at the ring, then back at me, and for a long moment he didn't say anything. Then, very quietly, "What was your father's name?" My heart stopped. "Colonel Daniel Kessler, sir. Air Force. He died 5 years ago." The general's face went pale. His jaw tightened, and he gripped the edge of the table. Then, and I will never forget this, his eyes filled with tears. He didn't make a sound. Didn't move. Just stood there, a 4-star general in a room full of officers, crying silently while everyone watched. Someone coughed. The maintenance commander looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Captain Ortiz touched my elbow, a warning, but I couldn't move. The general blinked, cleared his throat, and straightened. "We'll continue this inspection after lunch." Dismissed. Everyone filed out quickly, desperate to escape the unbearable tension. I started to follow, but Lieutenant Colonel Pierce grabbed my arm in the hallway. "What the hell was that, Kessler?" "Sir, you don't question a 4-star general in the middle of a briefing. You don't ask personal questions during an official inspection. Do you have any idea what you just did?" I saw my father's ring on his hand. My voice shook now. The ring that was buried with him. "I need to know, you need to remember your place." Pierce's face was red. "You just embarrassed this entire unit in front of Air Combat Command leadership. I want a written explanation on my desk by 1700 hours, and you're off the escort team effective immediately." He walked away, and I stood alone in the hallway, shaking with adrenaline and confusion, and something that felt like grief cracking open all over again. I didn't write the explanation. I went back to my dorm room and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The ring was impossible. My father had been buried with it. I'd watched them close the casket. There was no way it could be on someone else's hand unless someone had taken it. Unless someone had gone into that grave and stolen it. Unless my father hadn't been buried with it at all, and I'd been lied to. Or unless there were 2 rings. I pulled out my phone and searched for General Marcus Redden. His service record was extensive, multiple combat deployments, command positions across 3 different major commands, decorated career spanning 4 decades. I scrolled through photos from change of command ceremonies, promotion events, official functions. In several of them, I could see the ring on his hand, clearly visible even in the small images. He'd been wearing it for years. Long before my father died. Which meant it wasn't stolen. Which meant what? That my father had given it to him? That they'd known each other? I searched for any connection between Daniel Kessler and Marcus Redden. Nothing came up. Different career tracks, different bases, no overlap that I could find in the public record. But the ring didn't lie. That ring was one of one, custom-made, with our family crest. There was no way 2 of them existed unless someone had deliberately made a duplicate. At 1800 hours, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find a young airman first class standing at attention. "Lieutenant Kessler, ma'am. General Redden requests your presence in Building 712, Conference Room C. Immediately, ma'am." My stomach dropped. "Understood. Thank you." The airman left, and I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. Then I put on my uniform jacket, checked my appearance in the mirror, and headed out into the evening cold. Building 712 was the wing headquarters, a low, sprawling structure on the north side of base. I signed in with the security desk, and a staff sergeant escorted me down a quiet hallway to a closed door. He knocked once, opened it, and gestured for me to enter. The general was alone, standing by the window with his back to me. I came to attention just inside the door. "Lieutenant Arya Kessler reporting as requested, sir." "Close the door, Lieutenant. And sit down." I did both. He turned to face me, and I could see the exhaustion in his face, the kind that comes from carrying something heavy for too long. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "Sir, I'm the one who know." He held up a hand. "You asked a legitimate question. I should have expected it the moment I saw your name on the escort roster. I just didn't think." He stopped, shook his head. "I didn't think it through." He sat down across from me, and for a moment he just looked at the ring on his hand. "I served with your father 30 years ago. Germany, Cold War tail end, back when we still thought the Soviets might roll tanks through the Fulda Gap any day." He was a captain. I was a major. We were part of a joint task force running contingency operations out of Ramstein. I'd never heard my father mention Germany. Never heard him mention any of this. "There was an incident," the general continued. "Classified, still is, so I can't give you details. But it went wrong. Very wrong. Your father pulled me out of a situation that should have killed me. Saved my life, no question. Afterward, when we were back at base, he gave me this ring." He held up his hand, showing me the crest. He said it was a family piece, that it meant something to him, and he wanted me to have it as a reminder that we look out for each other. I tried to refuse, told him it was too personal, too valuable. He wouldn't take it back. Said he'd had a duplicate made years earlier, that wearing one would remind him of the other, and that I should keep it. So I did. The room felt very small. Very quiet. "I wore it for 30 years, the general said softly. "Through 3 deployments, 2 command tours, every major event in my career. It's been on my hand so long I forget it's there. And then today I walked into that briefing room and saw you, and the way you looked at it, I knew. I knew exactly who you were before you even said your father's name. Why didn't he tell me?" My voice came out broken. "Why didn't he ever mention you?" "I don't know." The general met my eyes. "We stayed in touch for a while after Germany. Emails, occasional phone calls. But we were on different career tracks, different bases. We drifted. Last time I spoke to him was maybe 10 years ago. I didn't even know he died until he stopped, pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, and slid it across the table. Until I received this." The envelope was addressed to General M, written in handwriting I recognized instantly. My father's precise, blocky print. "It arrived 6 months after he died," the general said. "Delayed delivery through his attorney, apparently set up in his will." I almost didn't open it. When I did, he gestured to the envelope. I picked it up with shaking hands, pulled out the letter inside, and started to read. "Marcus, if you're reading this, I'm gone. Hopefully you've had time to forget me, or at least file me away with the other ghosts from the old days. But I need to say some things, and I need someone to hear them who'll understand. I made a lot of mistakes. Career mistakes, personal mistakes, mistakes I don't have words for. I let the mission consume everything: my marriage, my health, my relationship with my daughter. I told myself it was necessary, that service required sacrifice, that she'd understand when she was older. I was wrong. She deserved better than a father who measured love in duty rosters and clean inspections. She deserved someone who could tell her he was proud without making it sound like a performance review. I don't know how to be that person. I've tried, but the words never come out right, and I'm afraid I've damaged something I can't fix. You asked me once, back in Germany, why I gave you the ring. I told you it was about loyalty, about looking out for each other. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. I gave it to you because I needed to believe that some part of me could exist outside the uniform, that some piece of the man I used to be before all this could survive in someone else's keeping. I'm not asking for forgiveness or understanding. I'm asking you to remember that I tried. That underneath all the rank and regulation, I tried to be a good father, even if I failed more often than I succeeded. If you ever meet my daughter, don't tell her any of this. Let her remember me however she needs to. She's stronger than I ever was. She'll be fine. DK, I read it twice, then set it down on the table because my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The general sat quietly, letting me process. He was wrong, I finally said. About what? I'm not fine. I looked up at him. I've spent 5 years trying to convince myself I was fine, and I'm not. I don't know who he was. I don't know what he wanted or what he regretted or why he couldn't just. My voice broke. Why couldn't he just talk to me? The general was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, because he didn't know how. Your father was one of the best officers I ever served with. Brilliant strategist, absolutely fearless, completely dedicated. But he was also the most emotionally locked down person I've ever met. He compartmentalized everything. I don't think he knew how to exist outside of duty. That doesn't make it hurt less. No, it doesn't. We sat there in the silence of that truth. Then the general said, for what it's worth, Lieutenant, I think he'd be very proud of the officer you've become. And I think he'd want you to know that his failures as a father don't define your worth. I nodded, unable to speak. Take the letter, he said. It's yours now. And if you ever want to talk about him, the real him, not the legend, my door is open. Thank you, sir. I stood to leave, but he stopped me. One more thing. Lieutenant Colonel Pierce spoke to me about the incident in the briefing. I informed him that your question was appropriate given the circumstances and that no disciplinary action is warranted. You're back on the escort team if you want to be. I'm not sure I do, sir. He nodded. Understood. Either way, you have my respect. I left the building and walked back across space in the dark, clutching my father's letter like it might disappear if I let go. That night I read it again and again, searching for hidden meaning in every line. But there wasn't any hidden meaning. It was just my father, being exactly who he'd always been, a man who understood duty and sacrifice, but struggled with love. For the first time in 5 years, I let myself cry for him. Not for the hero everyone else remembered, but for the flawed, complicated man who'd tried his best and knew it wasn't enough. The inspection continued for 2 more days. I stayed off the escort team but watched from the periphery as the general moved through the base, asking questions, evaluating systems, making notes. He was thorough, exacting, and completely professional. On the final day, he conducted an outbrief with the wing leadership. I wasn't required to attend, but Captain Ortiz texted me the highlights, overall rating of effective, several areas flagged for improvement, recognition for strong performance in logistics coordination. The base had passed. Everyone could breathe again. That evening, Lieutenant Colonel Pierce called me into his office. Kessler, sit down. I sat. He looked uncomfortable, which was unusual for him. I owe you an apology, he said abruptly. I overreacted the other day. The general explained the situation, and I was out of line reprimanding you in the hallway. Sir, I understand the pressure you are under. That's not an excuse for treating a subordinate officer unprofessionally. He leaned back in his chair. I've been on edge about this inspection for months. Too much writing on it, too many eyes watching. When you asked that question, I panicked. I thought you were going to derail everything. I wasn't trying to, I know. You were trying to understand something that didn't make sense. That's what good officers do. He paused. I also owe you an apology for the comments I made about your father. I've been using his reputation as a measuring stick for you, and that's not fair. You're your own officer. You should be evaluated on your own merit. I didn't know what to say. Pierce had never been warm, but this level of candor was unprecedented. Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Don't appreciate it. Just keep doing good work. He slid a folder across the desk. Your performance review. I bumped your marks in several categories based on your work during the inspection prep. You earned it. I opened the folder and scanned the evaluation. The scores were solid, better than I'd expected. I'm also recommending you for early promotion consideration, Pierce continued. You're eligible for captain in 8 months. With the right endorsements, you could pin on in 6. Early promotion. That was significant. That was career acceleration. I don't know what to say, sir. Say you'll keep your head down and keep performing. That's all I need from you. I left his office feeling unsteady. The last 72 hours had appended everything I thought I understood about my place on this base. I'd been so focused on staying invisible, on avoiding comparison to my father, that I hadn't realized I was actually building something of my own. The next morning, I met Captain Ortiz for coffee at the base exchange. She slid into the booth across from me with a knowing smile. "So, you going to tell me what happened in that meeting with the general?" I considered deflecting, but Lynn had been a good friend. She deserved honesty. "He knew my father. Served with him 30 years ago. The ring, it was a gift." Her eyes widened. "Seriously?" "Yeah. My father had a duplicate made. Gave one to the general after he saved his life during some classified op in Germany." Jesus, Arya. That's complicated. It's complicated. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup. He also left the general a letter. Before he died. About regrets and mistakes and things he wished he'd said. Lynn reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Are you okay?" "I'm getting there." I took a breath. It's strange, you know? I spent so long trying to escape his shadow, and then I find out he was carrying all this guilt about not being a better father. Like we were both trying to live up to impossible standards neither of us actually set. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know. Keep working. Stop apologizing for existing. Maybe actually talk to the general again, if he meant what he said about his door being open." "Good. You deserve answers. And support." She sipped her coffee. "Also, I heard you're getting recommended for early promotion." I groaned. News travels fast. Base this size? Always. People are impressed, by the way. Word is you handled the inspection drama with serious professionalism. I asked a 4-star general a personal question in the middle of a briefing. "Yeah, and he respected you for it." "That's not nothing." She was right. It wasn't nothing. Over the next few weeks, life on base settled back into routine. The inspection team departed, duty schedules returned to normal, and people stopped walking around with permanent tension in their shoulders. I went back to my regular work, logistics coordination, supply chain management, all the unglamorous tasks that kept operations running. But something had shifted. Officers who'd barely acknowledged me before started including me in planning meetings. Senior NCOs asked for my input on process improvements. Lieutenant Colonel Pierce assigned me to lead a project streamlining our equipment tracking systems. Real responsibility, not just admin work. I also started getting emails from General Redden. Nothing personal, just professional check-ins. He'd send articles about leadership or logistics innovations, always with a brief note. "Thought you might find this useful." I responded politely, kept things professional, but I appreciated the gesture. He was keeping his word about the open door, just doing it carefully. 3 months after the inspection, I received orders for a temporary duty assignment, 30 days at Air Combat Command Headquarters, working directly with the logistics planning staff. It was the kind of opportunity junior officers competed for. I suspected the general had something to do with it, but when I emailed to thank him, his response was brief. "You earned it. Make the most of it." I did. I spent a month working 16-hour days, learning from field-grade officers who'd been doing this work for decades. I built briefings, analyzed supply chains, and sat in on planning sessions for operations I couldn't discuss outside classified spaces. It was exhausting and exhilarating and exactly what I needed. When I returned to Edwards, I had a new clarity about what I wanted from my career. Not to hide from my father's legacy, but not to be defined by it either. I wanted to be good at this job because I was good at it, not because of whose daughter I was. 6 months after the inspection, I was promoted to captain. The ceremony was small, just my squadron, a few friends, and Lieutenant Colonel Pierce, who pinned on my new rank and shook my hand with something that almost looked like pride. Captain Ortiz hosted a small celebration at her place that evening. A dozen officers from the base showed up, brought beer and terrible pizza, and we sat around talking about deployments and bad commanders and the eternal question of whether to stay in or get out. At some point, Lynn pulled me aside. "You seem different." "Good different." "I feel different." I looked around the room, at people who'd become friends, at a career that was starting to feel like mine. I think I finally stopped waiting for permission to exist here. About damn time. She was right. It was about damn time. 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from General Redden. Not an email, an actual call, which was unusual. Captain Kessler, do you have a moment? Yes, sir. Of course. I'm going to be at Edwards next month for a conference. I'd like to meet for coffee if your schedule allows. Off duty, off the record. Just two people who knew the same man. I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't sure I was ready. Sir, can I ask you something first? Of course. Why now? Why reach out now, after all this time? He was quiet for a moment. Then, because I think we both have questions that only the other person can answer. And because I think your father would want us to know each other, the real people, not the ranks. Okay, I said. Coffee sounds good. We met 3 weeks later at a small cafe off base. He showed up in civilian clothes, jeans, and a button-down shirt, and for the first time I saw him as just a man, not a 4-star general. He was still imposing, still carried himself with authority, but without the uniform he seemed more human. We talked for 2 hours. He told me stories about my father I'd never heard, about his dry sense of humor, his obsessive attention to detail, the way he'd memorize entire operation orders and recite them back verbatim. He told me about the incident in Germany, or at least the parts that weren't still classified. He told me my father had been terrified most of the time, but had never let it show. I told him about growing up on bases, about learning to iron shirts and manage bills, about the feeling of never quite being enough. I told him about the silence in our house, the way my father communicated through structure instead of words. He loved you, the general said at one point. I know that's not enough, and I know it doesn't undo the hurt, but he did love you. He just didn't know how to show it in a way you could feel. I know. I'm starting to understand that. Good. Because you deserve to know the whole truth about him, the brilliant parts and the broken parts. Both were real. We finished our coffee, and as we stood to leave, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. I want you to have this. I opened it. Inside was the ring, his ring, the one my father had given him 30 years ago. Sir, I can't. Yes, you can. I've worn it long enough. It should go back to your family. He smiled slightly. Besides, I think your father would like knowing it ended up with you. I looked at the ring, at the family crest engraved in the onyx, and felt something settle in my chest. Not closure exactly, but acceptance. Thank you, I said. For everything. Thank you for asking the hard question. It's easy to let the past stay buried. Takes courage to dig it up. We shook hands, and he walked to his car. I stood there in the parking lot, holding the ring, and thought about my father, about the man he'd been, the father he'd tried to be, and the legacy he'd left behind. I didn't put the ring on. Instead, I took it back to my quarters and placed it in my desk drawer, next to the letter he'd written. 2 pieces of a man I was still learning to understand. A year passed. I stayed at Edwards, continued working in logistics, and slowly built a reputation as someone who could solve complex problems without drama. I deployed twice, short rotations to the Middle East, supporting contingency operations. I made captain ahead of my peers and got selected for a developmental assignment at Air Staff. I stayed in touch with General Redden. We exchanged emails every few months, and occasionally he'd call to ask how I was doing or to offer advice on career decisions. It wasn't a father-daughter relationship. I didn't need that, and he didn't try to be that. It was something else. Mentorship, maybe. Or just mutual respect between 2 people who understood loss. On the 5th anniversary of my father's death, I drove out to the base cemetery where he was buried. I hadn't been back since the funeral. I'd told myself it was because I was busy, because I'd moved on, but really I just hadn't been ready to face it. His headstone was simple. Name, rank, dates of service. Nothing about who he'd been as a person, as a father. Just the official record. I stood there for a long time, and then I said the things I'd needed to say for 5 years. I'm doing okay, Dad. I made captain. I'm good at my job. People respect me, not because of you, but because of me. I think you'd be proud of that. I paused, trying to find the right words. I found out about the ring. About General Redden. About the letter you left him. I wish you'd told me all of it while you were alive, but I understand why you didn't. You weren't good at talking about feelings. Neither am I. Guess I got that from you. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees planted along the cemetery fence. I'm not angry anymore. I'm just sad sometimes. Sad that we didn't get more time. Sad that you carried so much guilt for things that maybe didn't need fixing. I loved you, even when I didn't understand you. I hope you knew that. I placed a hand on the headstone, cold granite under my palm. I'm going to be okay. Better than okay. I'm going to build something you'd be proud of. Not because I owe it to you, but because I owe it to myself. I stood there a while longer, then walked back to my car and drove back to base. Life continued. I received orders to the Pentagon, a prestigious assignment that would position me well for future promotions. I packed up my quarters at Edwards, said goodbye to Captain Ortiz and the handful of officers who'd become real friends, and prepared for the next chapter. The day before I left, I opened my desk drawer and looked at the ring one more time. I still hadn't worn it. It sat there, a reminder of complicated history and imperfect love. I thought about keeping it in the drawer, carrying it with me to Washington as a talisman. But that felt wrong. The ring wasn't mine to carry as a burden or a badge. Instead, I took it to a jeweler and had it mounted in a shadow box with my father's ribbons and a small photo of him in uniform. I hung the shadow box in my new apartment in Virginia, where I could see it but not obsess over it. A memorial, not a weight. 3 years after the inspection, I made Major. General Redden attended my promotion ceremony. He happened to be at the Pentagon that week, he said, though I suspected he'd planned the trip around it. After the ceremony, we had dinner at a quiet restaurant in Arlington. Your father would have been insufferable about this, he said, raising his glass. Proud, but insufferable. He'd have told everyone in earshot that his daughter made Major below the zone. I laughed. Yeah, he would have. For what it's worth, Captain Kessler, he caught himself. Major Kessler. You've earned every bit of this. You're one of the best young officers I've seen come through the system in years. Thank you, sir. That means a lot. I mean it. You've got a bright future ahead of you. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. We finished dinner, and as we stood to leave, he pulled something from his pocket. An envelope. One more thing. I found this in my files a few months ago. Another letter from your father, written around the same time as the one you have. I think he meant for me to pass it along eventually, but the timing never felt right. Until now. I took the envelope with shaking hands. Have you read it? No. It's addressed to you. I waited until I was back in my apartment to open it. The handwriting was my father's, dated 6 months before he died. Arya, if you're reading this, it means someone I trusted gave it to you at a time when you needed it. I hope that person is Marcus Redden. If it's not, I hope whoever it is has been kind. I'm writing this because I need you to know some things, and I'm not brave enough to say them while I'm still alive. That's a weakness, I know. One of many. I'm proud of you. Not because you followed me into the Air Force, not because you made good grades or kept the house running while I was deployed. I'm proud of you because you're stronger than I ever was. You've got your mother's heart and my discipline, and that's a better combination than I ever managed. I know I wasn't the father you deserved. I know I measured everything in duty and structure because I didn't know how else to show love. I know I let you carry burdens that weren't yours to carry. I'm sorry for all of it. But I need you to know this. You don't owe me anything. Not loyalty to my memory, not obligation to finish what I started, not the burden of living up to expectations I never articulated. You owe yourself a life that's yours, built on your terms, for your reasons. If you stay in the Air Force, do it because you love the work, not because you think it'll make me proud. If you leave, do it because there's something else you want more. Either way, I'm proud. I was always proud. I just didn't know how to say it. Live well, Arya. Be happy. That's all I ever wanted for you. Love. Dad, I read it 3 times, and then I sat on my couch and cried until I had nothing left. It wasn't closure. There's no such thing as closure when you lose someone. But it was permission to let go of the weight I'd been carrying, permission to build a life that was mine. The next morning, I woke up and went for a run along the Potomac. The sun was just coming up, turning the water gold, and I felt lighter than I had in years. I thought about my father, about the man he'd been, the father he'd tried to be, and the words he'd finally found after he was gone. I thought about General Redden, about the ring, about the strange path that had led me to this moment. And I thought about the future, about the career I was building, the person I was becoming, and the freedom that came from finally understanding that I didn't have to carry anyone's legacy but my own. I wasn't the colonel's daughter anymore. I wasn't trying to earn approval from a ghost. 10 years later, I stood in the same briefing room at Edwards Air Force Base where I'd first seen the ring. The room hadn't changed much, same conference table, same projector screen, same fluorescent lights that made everyone look vaguely unwell. But everything else was different. I was a lieutenant colonel now, wearing silver oak leaves that had taken 14 years of service to earn. My uniform carried ribbons from 3 combat deployments, 2 commendations for exceptional service, and a Bronze Star from a logistics operation in Afghanistan that had kept supply lines open during a critical offensive. I'd served at the Pentagon, commanded a logistics squadron in Germany, and spent 18 months at the Air War College in Alabama. I'd built a career that was unmistakably mine. I was back at Edwards for a week-long visit, officially as part of an operational assessment team, unofficially because the wing commander had specifically requested my expertise on a supply chain modernization project. It felt strange walking these halls again, seeing the same buildings where I'd spent my early years as a lieutenant, where everything had changed in the span of a single inspection. Captain Ortiz, now Major Ortiz, had retired 2 years earlier and was teaching logistics at a civilian university in Colorado. We still texted regularly, still met for coffee whenever our schedules aligned. She'd gotten married, had a daughter, and built a life outside the uniform that seemed genuinely happy. Sometimes I envied that clarity of purpose, but mostly I was just glad she'd found what she was looking for. Lieutenant Colonel Pierce had made full colonel and was running a wing somewhere in Japan. We'd never been friends, but we developed mutual respect over the years. He'd written one of my promotion recommendations, and I'd done the same for him. That was the thing about the military. People who started as obstacles sometimes became allies, simply because you both survived long enough to gain perspective. General Redden had retired 3 years ago at the rank of 4-star, after serving as the commander of Air Combat Command. His retirement ceremony had been massive, hundreds of officers, a flyover, speeches from people who outranked everyone I'd ever met. I'd attended in my dress blues, standing in the back of the crowd, watching as they honored a career that had spanned 42 years. Afterward, at the reception, he'd found me in the crowd and pulled me aside. "Arya," he'd said, he'd started using my first name a few years earlier, after I'd made major and we'd transitioned from formal mentorship to something more like friendship. "I want you to have something." He'd handed me a small wooden box, the kind used for retirement flags. Inside was a folded American flag, the one that had flown over Air Combat Command headquarters on his last day in command. "Sir, I can't accept." "Yes, you can. Your father would have wanted you to have it. And so do I." He'd smiled, and for the first time I'd seen him look genuinely at peace. "You've become exactly the kind of officer he hoped you'd be. I'm proud to have known you both." I'd taken the flag home and placed it next to the shadow box containing my father's ring and ribbons. A different kind of legacy, built on connection rather than blood. Now, standing in this briefing room at Edwards, I was preparing to deliver an assessment to the current wing commander, a brigadier general I'd never met before, someone who'd arrived at this base long after I'd left. The base had cycled through 3 wing commanders in the 10 years since I'd been stationed here. That was military life, constant rotation, constant change, everyone passing through on their way to somewhere else. The door opened, and the wing commander walked in, Brigadier General Sarah Vance, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 50s with a reputation for running tight operations and suffering no fools. She was accompanied by her deputy commander, a colonel named Martinez, and the current chief of logistics, a major who looked about 12 years old. "Colonel Kessler," General Vance said, extending her hand. "Thank you for making the trip." "Ma'am. Happy to help." We settled around the table, and I walked them through my assessment, 3 days of reviewing their supply chain operations, identifying bottlenecks, recommending process improvements. It was technical work, the kind of thing I'd become known for over the years. I developed a specialty in logistics optimization, had written papers on it, had taught courses at Air University. It was unglamorous, but essential, and I was good at it. The briefing went smoothly. General Vance asked smart questions, pushed back on a few recommendations, and ultimately agreed to implement most of my suggestions. We wrapped up in 90 minutes, and as people gathered their materials to leave, she stopped me. "Colonel, do you have a few minutes? I'd like to speak with you privately." "Of course, ma'am." The others filed out and General Vance closed the door. She sat back down and studied me for a moment. "I've been reading your service record," she said. "Impressive career trajectory. Multiple commendations, strong performance reviews, command experience. You're on track for full colonel, probably within the next promotion cycle." "Thank you, ma'am. I'm also aware of your personal history with this base. Your father served, you were stationed here as a lieutenant. There was an incident during an inspection 10 years ago involving General Redden." My stomach tightened slightly. I'd thought that story had been buried in old files, forgotten by everyone except the people who'd been there. "Yes, ma'am. That's accurate. I'm not bringing it up to embarrass you. I'm bringing it up because I want to offer you something." She leaned forward. "I'm standing up a new logistics group here at Edwards, expanded mission, bigger budget, significant strategic importance. I need someone to command it. Someone with your expertise, your track record, and your ability to handle complex situations with professionalism." I stared at her. "You're offering me a command position?" "Group commander." "Oh, 6th level, which means you'd pin on full colonel as part of the assignment. It's a promotion and a command rolled into one." She paused. "I know it means coming back to a base that has complicated history for you. That's why I wanted to have this conversation face-to-face, off the record. If you're not interested, I understand. But I think you'd be perfect for it." I sat back in my chair, trying to process what she was saying. A command position. Full colonel. At Edwards, where everything had started. "Can I ask why you chose me, ma'am?" "There are plenty of qualified O5s who could take this position." "Because I did my homework. I talked to people who've worked with you. I read your efficiency reports going back 10 years. And I spoke with General Redden." "You spoke with the general?" "He's on my speed dial. We served together years ago. When I found out you were the same Kessler who'd been stationed here as a lieutenant, I called him. Asked him what kind of officer you were." She smiled slightly. "He spoke very highly of you. Said you were one of the best young leaders he'd encountered in his entire career. Said you had integrity, intelligence, and the courage to ask hard questions when everyone else stayed quiet." I felt my throat tighten. Even in retirement, Marcus was still looking out for me. "He also said something else," General Vance continued. "He said you'd spent your early career trying to escape your father's shadow, and that coming back here might give you the chance to build something entirely your own." I thought that was insightful. "It is. So what do you think? Are you interested?" I looked around the briefing room, at the walls that had witnessed one of the most important moments of my life. 10 years ago, I'd stood in this space and demanded answers from a 4-star general. I'd been terrified and grief-stricken and absolutely certain I was about to destroy my career. Instead, I'd started building it. "I'm interested, ma'am. Very interested." "Good. I'll submit the paperwork this week. You should have official orders within a month." She stood, and I stood with her. "Welcome back to Edwards, Colonel Kessler. I think you're going to do great things here." I left the building and walked across the base, taking in the familiar landscape. The flight line where I'd watched the general's plane land 10 years ago. The headquarters building where I'd reported for duty as a brand new lieutenant. The cemetery where my father was buried. On impulse, I drove over to the cemetery. I hadn't been back since that day 5 years after his death, when I'd finally said the things I needed to say. Now, 15 years after he died, I stood at his grave again. The headstone looked older now, weathered by sun and wind. Someone had placed a small American flag next to it, probably the grounds crew. They did that for all the military graves. I knelt down and touched the stone. "Hey, Dad," I said quietly. "I'm coming back. Full colonel, command position. Leading a logistics group, your worst nightmare, I know. You were always more interested in strategy than supply chains." I smiled, imagining his response. He'd have been proud in his quiet way. Probably would have said something like, "Don't let it go to your head," while secretly bragging to everyone he knew. "I'm not scared this time," I continued. 10 years ago, I was terrified of being here, of being compared to you, of failing to live up to some impossible standard. But I'm not that person anymore. I've built my own career. I've earned my own rank. And I'm coming back here on my terms, to do work I'm good at, for reasons that have nothing to do with you. The wind rustled through the trees, and I let myself feel the full weight of that truth. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't hiding. I was just moving forward, carrying the past, but not controlled by it. "I think you'd be proud," I said. "I hope you would be. But either way, I'm proud of myself. And I think that's what you wanted all along." I stood, brushed off my uniform, and walked back to my car. 3 months later, I pinned on the rank of colonel in a ceremony at Edwards. General Vance presided, reading the promotion orders in a clear voice while my new logistics group stood in formation. Major Ortiz flew out from Colorado for the ceremony, along with a handful of other officers I'd served with over the years. And standing in the back, in civilian clothes, was Marcus Redden. After the ceremony, after the formal reception and the obligatory photos, Marcus pulled me aside. "Congratulations, Colonel Kessler." "Thank you, sir. And thank you for the recommendation. General Vance told me you spoke with her." I told her the truth. That you're an exceptional officer who deserves every opportunity that comes your way. He paused. I also told her about the day you asked me about the ring. About how you had the courage to confront a 4-star general in the middle of an inspection because something didn't make sense. That kind of integrity is rare. I was terrified. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it. He smiled. Your father understood that. So do you. I read his letters again last week, I admitted. The ones you gave me. They still hurt, but differently now. Less like grief and more like understanding. That's growth. That's healing. Marcus looked around at the base, at the buildings and runways stretching into the distance. I'm glad you're back here. I think this place still has things to teach you. What kind of things? That you can return to the place where you felt smallest and stand there as the person you've become. That's powerful. Don't underestimate it. He was right. Standing here in full colonel rank, commanding a group of my own, I felt the symmetry of it. The frightened lieutenant I'd been, and the confident colonel I'd become, both real, both part of the same journey. Over the next 2 years, I poured myself into building the logistics group. We modernized supply tracking systems, reduced equipment turnaround times by 30%, and established new partnerships with civilian contractors that saved the Air Force millions of dollars. I mentored junior officers, fought for resources, and navigated the complex politics of base leadership with the kind of skill that only came from years of experience. I also started speaking more openly about my father. Not to trade on his reputation, but to honor the complicated reality of who he'd been. When junior officers asked about military families, about balancing service with personal relationships, I shared what I'd learned, the importance of communication, the danger of letting duty consume everything, the need to be present even when the mission pulled you away. One afternoon, a young first lieutenant named Chin came to my office. She'd requested the meeting through official channels, marking it as personal rather than professional. I invited her in, offered her coffee, and waited. "Ma'am, I need advice," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "My father is a colonel. He has very specific expectations about my career. He wants me to follow his path: pilot training, fighter squadron, command track. But I don't want that. I want to work in intelligence. And I'm terrified to tell him because I don't want to disappoint him." I looked at this young officer, seeing myself 15 years earlier, and I knew exactly what to say. "Lieutenant Chin, let me tell you about my father." I told her the whole story, the difficult relationship, the silence, the ring, the letters, the slow process of understanding that I didn't owe anyone a career built to their specifications. I told her about the years I'd wasted trying to be invisible, trying to avoid comparison, trying to earn approval from someone who was gone. "Here's what I learned," I said. "You can't live your life trying to fulfill someone else's expectations. Not your father's, not anyone's. You have to build a career that's yours, one that uses your strengths, that feeds your passion, that feels meaningful to you. If your father can't support that, it's his loss. But you owe it to yourself to try. Chin nodded, tears in her eyes. Did you ever regret it? Choosing your own path? Not once. The only thing I regret is not doing it sooner. She thanked me and left, and I sat at my desk feeling the weight of that conversation. I'd become the kind of leader I'd needed when I was a lieutenant, someone who understood the complexity of military families, who could speak honestly about struggle, who wouldn't judge or dismiss. That night, I called Marcus. We'd stayed in touch regularly since his retirement, phone calls every few weeks, occasional dinners when we were in the same city. He'd become something like family, though we'd never formally defined it. He was too old to be a father figure, too close to be just a mentor. He was Marcus, a connection to my past and a steady presence in my present. How's command treating you? He asked. Good. Busy. I had an interesting conversation with the lieutenant today about parental expectations and career choices. Let me guess, you told her the truth about your father. I did. Is that wrong? It's honest. That's never wrong. He paused. You know, your father would be amazed by the officer you've become. Not just the rank or the accomplishments, but the kind of leader you are. You do the thing he never could, you connect with people. You let them see your humanity. That's rare, especially at your level. I learned from watching what didn't work. That's wisdom. Most people just repeat their parents' mistakes. You learned from them instead. We talked for another hour about work and retirement and the strange passage of time. Before we hung up, Marcus said, I'm coming to California next month for a conference. Can I take you to dinner? Of course. I'd like that. Good. I have something I want to give you. A month later, we met at the same cafe where we'd had coffee 10 years earlier. Marcus looked older now, fully gray, more lines around his eyes, but still vital, still present. Retirement agreed with him. He spent his time consulting, teaching occasional courses at the Air War College, and traveling with a woman he'd been dating for the past year. Over dinner, he caught me up on his life, and I told him about the logistics group, about the projects we were working on, about the satisfaction of building something that would outlast my time at Edwards. Then, as we were finishing dessert, he pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. I found this when I was cleaning out my storage unit, he said. I've been holding on to it for 30 years, and I think it's time it went to the right person. I unwrapped the package carefully. Inside was a leather-bound journal, worn at the edges, with my father's name embossed on the cover. What is this? Your father's personal journal from our time in Germany. He gave it to me for safekeeping before a particularly dangerous operation, said if anything happened to him, I should make sure it didn't fall into the wrong hands. Then we both survived, and he never asked for it back. I don't think he wanted to remember what he'd written. I opened the journal carefully. The pages were filled with my father's precise handwriting entries dated across 6 months in 1994. I scanned a few lines, seeing words like fear, responsibility, failure, hope. Have you read it? I asked. Years ago, after he died. I wanted to understand who he'd been back then, what he'd been carrying. Marcus met my eyes. It's honest, Arya. Maybe more honest than he ever was in life. I think you should have it, but only if you're ready to see that version of him. I closed the journal and held it in my hands, feeling the weight of another piece of my father's hidden life. Thank you, I said, for keeping it safe all these years. Thank you for being someone worthy of receiving it. I took the journal home and spent the next week reading it slowly in small doses. Marcus was right, it was brutally honest. My father wrote about his fears during dangerous operations, his guilt about leaving me alone so often, his struggle to balance duty with fatherhood. He wrote about my mother, about the grief that never fully healed, about feeling inadequate as a single parent. But he also wrote about pride in my resilience, pride in my intelligence, pride in the person I was becoming. He wrote about hoping I'd have a better life than he'd managed, that I'd find balance he'd never achieved, that I'd be brave enough to pursue happiness instead of just duty. Reading his words, I finally understood something I'd spent 15 years trying to figure out. My father had been just as lost as I'd been. Just as uncertain, just as afraid of failing the people he loved. The difference was that he'd never learned to ask for help, never learned to be vulnerable, never learned that strength could coexist with honesty about struggle. I didn't have to repeat that pattern. I could be strong and uncertain, accomplished and still learning, successful and still human. The revelation was quieter than I expected. No dramatic moment of clarity, just a gentle settling of truth into place. I called Marcus that night. I finished the journal. And I think I finally understand him. Not as the father I needed him to be, but as the person he actually was. That's all any of us can ask for, to be understood as we are, not as people wish we were. Thank you, Marcus. For all of it. For keeping his memory alive, for being honest with me, for showing me what healthy connection looks like. His voice was warm when he responded. You've made it easy, Arya. You're the best parts of both your parents. Your father's discipline and intelligence, your mother's heart and openness. That's a powerful combination. We talked a while longer, and when we hung up, I felt more at peace than I had in years. 6 months later, I received a message through official channels. I'd been selected for promotion to Brigadier General. Oh, 7. 1 star. The notification came with a personal note from the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, congratulating me on a distinguished career and informing me that I'd be taking command of a major logistics wing at Scott Air Force Base in Illinois. I sat at my desk at Edwards, staring at the promotion notification and let the reality sink in. General. I was going to be a general. I called Marcus immediately. I made it. 1 star. He laughed, a sound of pure joy. I knew you would. Congratulations, Arya. Your father would be bursting with pride. So would my mother, I think. Absolutely. They both would. He paused. When's the ceremony? 3 months. They want me at Scott by the end of the year. I'll be there. Front row. I wouldn't have it any other way. I spent the next few months transitioning out of command at Edwards and preparing for the move to Illinois. General Vance threw me a farewell ceremony that was both professional and genuinely warm. The logistics group I'd built presented me with a plaque commemorating our work together, and several junior officers thanked me privately for mentorship that had changed their careers. On my last day at Edwards, I drove to the cemetery one final time. I stood at my father's grave in my uniform, soon to carry a star on its shoulder. I made General, Dad, I said quietly. Brigadier General Arya Kessler. First woman in our family to reach flag rank, first in either of our careers to make it this far. I paused. I wish you were here to see it. I wish we'd had more time, better communication, a chance to know each other as adults. The familiar ache of loss washed over me, but it was gentler now. Manageable. But I also know that everything I've accomplished, I've earned on my own terms. I'm not you. I'm not trying to be you. I'm just me, flawed and driven and still learning. And I think that's enough. I placed my hand on the headstone one last time. Rest well, Colonel. Your daughter's doing just fine. I walked back to my car, drove off base, and headed toward the future, one I'd built deliberately, honestly, with courage I'd learned through struggle. The promotion ceremony at Scott Air Force Base was held on a crisp October morning. Hundreds of officers attended, along with my handful of close friends and Marcus Redden, who stood in the front row with tears in his eyes as they pinned the single star to my shoulder. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it brief. I stand here today because of many people, mentors who challenged me, colleagues who supported me, and family who showed me both what to emulate and what to learn from. I've spent 20 years in this uniform learning that leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest, being present, and being brave enough to ask hard questions when everyone else stays silent. I glanced at Marcus, who smiled. To the junior officers watching today, build your own path. Honor those who came before you, but don't be controlled by their expectations. And never be afraid to demand answers when something doesn't make sense. That's how we grow. That's how we lead. The ceremony ended, and as people congratulated me, I felt the full weight of what I'd achieved. Not despite my father's complicated legacy, but through the long process of understanding it, accepting it, and choosing my own way forward. That evening, Marcus and I had dinner at a quiet restaurant off base. To Brigadier General Kessler, he said, raising his glass. The finest officer I've had the privilege of knowing. To family, I replied. Chosen and given, complicated and beautiful. We clinked glasses, and I looked across the table at this man who'd been a stranger 15 years ago, who'd entered my life through grief and coincidence, and who'd become one of the most important people in my world. Thank you, I said. For everything. For being honest about my father, for sharing his letters, for showing me that connection doesn't have to be perfect to be real. Thank you for asking that question 15 years ago. For having the courage to demand truth. It changed both our lives. He was right. That single moment in a briefing room at Edwards, terrifying and impulsive and completely necessary, had set everything in motion. It had forced me to confront my father's complexity, to stop running from his shadow, and to start building something authentically mine. As we finished dinner and said our goodbyes, I thought about the ring that had started it all still sitting in its shadow box at home, next to my father's letters and the flag from Marcus's retirement. 3 pieces of a story about loss and connection, about learning to carry the past without being crushed by it. I drove back to base under a sky full of stars, wearing a single star of my own, and felt profoundly grateful for every difficult step that had brought me here. The journey wasn't over. There would be new challenges, new struggles, new moments when I'd have to choose between the easy path and the honest one. But I knew who I was now. I knew what I stood for. And I knew that closure didn't come from having all the answers. It came from learning to live with complexity, from choosing growth over comfort, from building a legacy that was unmistakably your own. I was Brigadier General Arya Kessler. And that was more than enough. And that's how one moment, one question, and one ring reshaped everything I thought I understood about my past and my place in the uniform. If you were in my shoes, would you have stopped the general? Would you have wanted to know the truth or left the past buried? And what would you have done with that letter? Let me know in the comments. I read all of them. If this story hit close to home, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need it. I'll see you in the next one.